Welcome back, Nooblets. Today we'll be tackling a notoriously difficult concept, but our explanation is so simple, I promise you'll understand it by the end of the video. We're going to be learning about internal rate of return and equity multiples. These two deal metrics are used in tandem to measure deal profitability, especially when you have multiple equity investors, and distributions are based on clearing IRR hurdles. Don't worry, you'll understand that too. Now don't be discouraged if you've had trouble understanding the internal rate of return, or IRR. I remember being super confused when I learned it back in school for a few reasons. First, the calculation is iterative, and it's a complete waste of time to do by hand. And let's face it, everyone in the industry just uses the Excel formula, so I won't even bother explaining the math. Second, most people teach the IRR as the discount rate required to make the sum of the net present values of all the annual cash flows equal to 0. That's confusing as f***. This definition has always left me with more questions than answers. And third, internal rate of return doesn't really help explain what it means. And the freaking abbreviation's impossible to pronounce. IRR. I sound like a pirate. A better name would be equivalent rate of return in retrospect. Let me explain why, using our favorite pipe and water tank analogy. If you haven't watched our previous videos, we've made an analogy between a P&L and a plumbing system, where your revenues flow from the top, divert some of it to the OPEX, and the remaining flow is your NOI. Attached to the pipe is a water tank, which represents all the cash flow you put in to buy your property, as well as the money you invest for improvements. Let's take a look at a sample deal's annual cash flows. First, note that the cash flow is not the NOI. It's the total amount of cash flowing in or out of your entire project in a given time period, whereas NOI is the income from the operating side only. So in our analogy, it's how much total water is flowing in or out of the entire system to or from the investors. In year 1, you and your partners put in your initial investment to acquire a $1 million property at a 5 cap. But you've come up with some good plans to boost your NOI to a 9 cap, or $90,000. But to get there, you have to put in additional capital to pay for improvements through the second year of the project. So your cash flow in year 2 is negative $20,000. In year 3, you're still working because you're gradually making changes as leases expire, so cash flow is $40,000 that year. In year 4, you do a large wave of units in the building, so your cash flow dips again to $15,000. In year 5, your investments start to pay off, and you hit $70,000 in NOI. In year 6, you've hit your target, $90,000 NOI. Then COVID hit in year 7, and you're dipping to $83,000 in NOI instead of building on the new $90,000 base. And after year 7, you cash out for $1.66 million. And with your $83,000 NOI in the previous year, that's where the price ended up. What a roller coaster. As another aside, pricing properties almost never ends up this simple, but we'll be discussing that in a huge rant I'm going to do in the near future. Now, after cashing out, you and your investors might get together to perform some analysis on how the investment did to figure out how the profits get distributed. One of the things they might want to know is, what was the equivalent annual percentage return we delivered? Or in other words, based on the dollars we invested, what fixed percentage rate did we earn every year on this investment? What we're looking for is the IRR. But what the IRR calculation does is take your bumpy ride to higher NOIs in the eventual sale and transforms it to look like this. So if we put in $1 million in year 1, the IRR calculation tells us that we need to earn 10.47% compounded over 8 years in order to make the same amount of money as the cash flows we achieved. Now, why would we want to calculate this? Because it's often used as a hurdle metric that we, the developer, aim to exceed in order to earn a bonus, which is called a promote in deal lingo. So if the hurdle was an 8% IRR, then you've met the goal to earn the promote. If the hurdle was 15%, you're in trouble and you may not even profit from this deal. The hurdle is typically decided upon early on when you're shopping around for investors. More on that in our upcoming Capstack video. Think of it as a game where we start off with a certain amount of cash, all sorts of in between, And at the end, we stop everything and tally up the score based on that precise moment in time. IRR removes the dimension of time in order to normalize the cash flow to compare it easily with other complex investments. Remember earlier, I said a more appropriate name for IRR is the equivalent rate of return in retrospect. Because after a certain amount of time has passed, you look back from day one and you figure out what the equivalent annual rate of return was. Makes a lot more sense, right? But hold up, there's a big problem in using the IRR by itself. Since the dimension of time was removed, it's hard to tell whether two investments with the same IRR are actually the same. This is where the equity multiple comes in. Equity multiples are a very simple concept. It's how much money is distributed to investors at the end of a project, expressed as a multiple of the amount of money they initially invested in the project. So if you put in $1 and you got 2, then your equity multiple is 2. Looking at the equity multiple in conjunction with the IRR puts the dimension of time back into the normalized comparison. Because imagine you've got two investments that yield a 20% IRR, but one of them has an equity multiple of 2, and the other one has an equity multiple of 3. This tells you that the investment horizons are different, because at a 20% rate, it would take longer to get to 3x than it would for 2x. The 2x multiple would take just under 4 years to achieve, whereas the 3x multiple would take 6 years to achieve. Hey, how'd I know that? Because there's actually a super handy IRR table. Across the top we have the years, and along the left we have the multiple. The IRR is in the grid. So for example, if we achieved a 2x multiple by the end of year 4, our IRR was 19%. Or if you really knocked it out of the park and you achieved a 5x multiple at the end of year 2, your IRR was a ridiculous 124%. If you memorize a few of these numbers, you can figure out your IRR from your multiple pretty quickly just by guesstimating. No Excel required. So in summary, IRRs and equity multiples both normalize complex investments so that you can compare them against each other. But one last thing before I end this video. I think IRR hurdles are the devil, because it prioritizes time over anything else. I've ranted about this before in my ethics and social responsibility videos, but basically, bad things happen if you try to rush things for profits. So proceed with caution. Now make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next episode, where we're going to cover how to use debt to juice your returns.